Well, you don't find me around too many lawyers today.
He gave us some of the most soulful songs in history, yet his life ended at the hands of his own father. A voice powerful enough to heal millions, but powerless against his own torment. Addiction, paranoia, betrayal. Behind the music was a man slowly unraveling before the world's eyes. Why did Marvin Gaye, the Prince of Motown, become one of the most overlooked tragedies in music? This is not just the story of a superstar, it is the story of a prophet in sound, crushed beneath the weight of his own pain. He rose from a childhood marked by faith and violence, carried his gift through the pews of church choirs, and transformed it into a sound that defined a generation. He sang love songs that felt like velvet, duets that touched the soul, and anthems that demanded justice from a broken world. But behind each note was a cost. Every hit carried the shadow of loss. Every triumph hid scars too deep to see. The man who sang "What's Going On" asked questions no one else dared to voice. Yet he struggled with answers of his own. Fame brought him glory, but it also brought loneliness. Success gave him wealth, but it could not buy peace. And in the end, the pain he tried so hard to escape came home. A life cut short not by accident or the excesses of stardom, but by violence that struck from within his own family. This is Celebrity Underrated, the Marvin Gaye story. Washington, D.C., 1939. The Great Depression still cast its long shadow over the nation's capital. In a modest home on First Street, SW, Alberta and Marvin Gaye Sr. welcomed a child into the world who would one day be hailed as the Prince of Soul. His name was Marvin Pence Gaye Jr., a boy destined to carry both divine blessing and devastating burden. From the earliest days of his life, music followed him like a spirit. His mother, Alberta, was a gentle and devout woman, unwavering in her faith and convinced that her son had been chosen for something great. She nurtured his gift, encouraging the small boy who could already silence a room with his voice at the age of 4. She embodied warmth, compassion, and stability in a household that otherwise pulsed with tension. For in the same home lived another force, his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., a storefront preacher with a rigid sense of religion. He was a man defined by deep repression and a violent streak that cast fear across the family. Publicly, Reverend Gaye thundered fire and brimstone sermons. Privately, he ruled the house with an iron fist. Marvin Jr. would later describe it with chilling clarity. Living with father was like living with a king, a very peculiar, changeable, cruel, and all-powerful king. According to family accounts and biographies like David Ritz's Divided Soul, Marvin endured beatings and psychological torment that left scars he carried for the rest of his life. His father resented his sensitivity, his softness, and some even suggested he envied his son's budding talent. The young boy grew up in constant tension between the faith that uplifted him and the fear that haunted him. Music became his refuge. In church, surrounded by hymns and gospel harmonies, Marvin discovered a sacred escape. He taught himself piano by ear, and his voice, still childlike, had the power to silence congregations. By his teenage years, he had developed perfect pitch, a rare gift that would later define the nuance and emotional power of his recording. While school left him introverted, shy, and often bullied, he found in music the armor he needed to withstand the world's blows. He immersed himself in the rich traditions of doo-wop and gospel quartets, studying harmonies with an almost spiritual devotion. Groups like the Soul Stirrers, fronted by the incomparable Sam Cooke, became both his idols and his foreshadowing. Cooke's tragic life would one day mirror Marvin's own, a man who blurred sacred and secular, who carried gospel into rhythm and blues, and who died far too young. Marvin's first real taste of performance came with a local group called the Rainbows. With them, he learned the intricacies of harmony, the confidence of stage presence, and how to blend his gospel roots with the emerging sounds of rhythm and blues. Though the group did not reach national fame, the experience was his apprenticeship in professionalism. That led him to another group, the Marquis, sometimes remembered as the Mares, who briefly recorded with OK Records under the guidance of Bo Diddley. The recordings failed to chart, but for Marvin, the sessions were proof that he was stepping into the world he longed for. The studio lights, the microphones, the possibility of being heard, it was enough to convince him that music could be his way forward. The Marquis eventually evolved into Harvey and the New Moonglows, under the leadership of Harvey Fuqua, a former member of the legendary Moonglows. Fuqua became one of the first true mentors in Marvin's life, guiding him not only musically but also in navigating the treacherous politics of the record industry. He taught him how to carry himself as a professional, how to approach arrangements, and most importantly, how to survive in a world that devoured young talent. When Fuqua relocated to Detroit in 1960, Marvin followed. It was a decisive step, one that pulled him out of Washington's shadows and into the beating heart of a new musical empire, Motown Records. The move was not just geographic, it was symbolic. Marvin was leaving behind the home that had shaped and scarred him, stepping onto a path that promised fame, fortune, and the possibility of transcending his past. Yet as he boarded that train for Detroit, Marvin carried ghosts with him, ghosts of a father's cruelty, a childhood of fear, and the psychological wounds that would never fully heal. The boy who had once silenced a church congregation was now ready to sing to the world, but as history would show, no matter how far Marvin Gaye traveled, the pain of his early life was never far behind. When Marvin arrived in Detroit in 1960, he was not chasing pop stardom in the way most young singers dreamed of. His heart was set on a different path. He wanted to be the next Nat King Cole. Jazz, crooning, elegant ballads sung for adults, that was the image Marvin held of himself. The glittering promise of Motown wasn't in his plans, but fate, and Berry Gordy, had other ideas. Introduced to Motown's founder by his mentor Harvey Fuqua, Marvin entered Hitsville, USA, not as a singer, but as a drummer. He was steady, instinctual, and precise, and the label put his talents to immediate use. You can hear his rhythm on early classics like Please Mr. Postman by the Marvelettes and Shop Around by the Miracles. He was content being the heartbeat behind the music rather than its voice. For a while, the anonymity of the rhythm section suited him just fine. But Berry Gordy was not blind. He saw a tall, handsome young man with a magnetic presence that could not stay hidden. Gordy pressed Marvin to record, and though Marvin resisted, eventually he relented. In 1961, he cut Let Your Conscience Be Your Guide, a jazzy ballad that showcased the crooner he longed to be. The record went largely unnoticed. Marvin was undeterred. He still believed sophistication, not commercial hits, would define him. Then came 1962, and with it, a modest breakthrough. Stubborn Kind of Fellow, a tune Marvin co-wrote, cracked the charts. It wasn't the jazz elegance he had dreamed of, but it revealed something undeniable. His voice had a texture and magnetism that the public responded to. Soon after, he delivered a string of increasingly confident singles: Hitchhike, Can I Get a Witness, Pride and Joy. Each record was smoother, sexier, more assured than the last. Marvin's voice carried something rare. It could seduce and soothe in the same breath. Fans began to call him the Prince of Motown, a crown he wore with quiet resistance. He understood the power of the label's machine, but he also felt confined by it. Motown was an assembly line of hits, polished and choreographed for mass appeal. Marvin, introverted by nature, often bristled against the expectations. He hated the dance routines, the rehearsed smiles, the slick pop image Berry Gordy demanded. What he wanted was depth lyrics with meaning, orchestrations with soul. But for now, he played along, allowing the machine to mold him while quietly searching for his own artistic voice. By 1967, Marvin's career took another leap forward in a way no one could have predicted. Motown paired him with a rising star named Tammy Terrell. What followed was one of the most beloved partnerships in R&B history. Together, they recorded songs that became cultural milestones. Ain't No Mountain High Enough, Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing, You're All I Need to Get By. The chemistry between Marvin and Tammy was electric. Their voices wove around each other with a natural intimacy that made audiences believe they were in love. The press speculated endlessly, but Marvin insisted their connection was spiritual, not physical. She was his muse, his sister in song, the one person in Motown he felt he could fully trust. On stage, they were magic. Off stage, tragedy loomed. In 1967, during a performance with Marvin, Tammy collapsed. The diagnosis was grim, a brain tumor. Over the next several years, Marvin visited her constantly, watching as her health deteriorated. The experience shook him to his core. For a man already prone to melancholy, the slow loss of his closest collaborator was devastating. When Tammy Terrell died in 1970 at just 24 years old, Marvin was inconsolable. He withdrew from the spotlight, retreating into depression and questioning whether he even wanted to continue making music. His career was soaring, his star rising higher than ever, but his spirit was fractured. The Motown machine pressed on, still churning out hits, but Marvin was beginning to slip away from its grip. And yet, even in grief, his artistry was sharpening. The lessons of those early years, the drumming, the harmony work, the Motown polish, the transcendent duets with Tammy were all inside him, waiting to be transformed. He was no longer just the Prince of Motown. He was becoming something more dangerous, more necessary. By the dawn of the 1970 seconds, Marvin Gaye stood at a crossroads. He could remain a cog in the hit-making machine, delivering love songs on command. Or he could risk everything to speak his truth, to channel the pain of his childhood, the grief of Tammy's death, and the turmoil of a country on fire into music that mattered. What came next would redefine not only his career but the sound of American soul forever. The death of Tammy Terrell in 1970 was more than a personal tragedy for Marvin Gaye. It was the shattering of his artistic foundation. She had been his closest collaborator, his sister in spirit, and the one person in Motown he fully trusted. When she was gone, something inside Marvin went silent. He stopped performing, stopped recording, and retreated into himself. For months, rumors swirled that he was quitting music altogether. To many, it seemed the Prince of Motown had nothing left to give. But while Marvin felt finished with Motown, he wasn't finished with music. The problem was that the Motown machine designed for polished love songs and feel-good anthems no longer matched the fire burning in him. Outside the studio, America was in chaos. The Vietnam War dragged on. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. Cities were burning, poverty deepened, and the black community was demanding real change. For Marvin, the question was no longer whether he could keep singing about love. It was whether he could afford not to sing about pain. The turning point came in the form of a letter from his younger brother, Frankie, who had just returned from Vietnam. The details were devastating. Dead friends, racism among the ranks, disillusionment with the American dream. "My country is full of hate," Frankie wrote. "We're dying for nothing." Marvin wept as he read the words. The despair of his brother's letter fused with his own grief over Tammy's death and his lifelong struggle with his father's abuse. Out of that storm came a vision. Sitting at his piano, Marvin began writing something Motown had never seen before. Not a love song, not a dance hit, but a plea, a prophecy, a cry for humanity. That song was "What's Going On?" When Marvin brought the track to Berry Gordy, the Motown founder was stunned, and not in a good way. Gordy flatly rejected it. He called it too political, too uncommercial, something that would tarnish Marvin's image and damage Motown's brand. But Marvin was resolute. He told Gordy, "If you don't release this, I'll never record another song for you again." The standoff was brief. In early 1971, What's Going On was released, and the world stopped to listen. With lush instrumentation, layered vocals, and Marvin's aching falsetto, the song wasn't just beautiful, it was urgent. It asked questions no one else dared to voice. Who really cares? What's going on? The single was an immediate success, reaching audiences far beyond Motown's traditional base. It was more than a record, it was a revelation. For the first time, Marvin had broken free of the formula, daring to address the struggles of his people and the fractures of his country. Critics hailed it as a turning point. Fans embraced it as a song that spoke their truth. In that moment, Marvin Gaye was no longer just the Prince of Motown. He had become something larger, the voice of a generation in pain. The release of What's Going On, the single, was only the beginning. Marvin Gaye wasn't just offering Motown a new kind of song, he was rewriting the very idea of what a soul album could be. In 1971, when the full album dropped, it was nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time, a Motown artist delivered a cohesive concept record, weaving together a tapestry of themes that stretched far beyond romance and dance. The song spoke directly to the turbulence of the times. "What's happening, brother?" echoed the voice of Frankie, recently home from Vietnam, asking how a returning soldier was supposed to find his place in a nation unraveling. Flying high in the friendly sky, confronted the suffocating escape of addiction, something Marvin himself already knew too well. Inner city blues, make me wanna holler, put the frustration of poverty and police brutality into melody, a cry of despair that was impossible to ignore. And Mercy, Mercy Me, the ecology, addressed environmental destruction years before ecology, was a common word on people's lips. This was not Motown as the world had known it. Gone were the bubblegum hooks, the choreographed smiles, the assembly line pop anthems. In their place stood a work of art, lush orchestration, layered harmonies, saxophone solos, and Marvin's soaring falsetto guiding the listener through a journey that was both personal confession and collective lament. The album didn't just reflect the world, it demanded the world look at itself. Critics immediately recognized the significance. Reviewers hailed it as a masterpiece, praising both its daring subject matter and its musical sophistication. The public, too, embraced it. The album went platinum, its singles topping charts, its questions resonating in a nation searching for answers. Decades later, the reverence would only deepen. In 2020, Rolling Stone ranked it #1 on its list of the greatest albums of all time, cementing its place as one of the most important works in American music history. And yet, Marvin himself remained unsettled. The praise, the sales, the accolades, none of it healed him. In interviews, he would say, "With the world exploding around me, how am I supposed to keep singing love songs?" He had poured his soul into the record, exposing his wounds for the world to hear. But rather than close them, the process seemed to open them wider. In a way, What's Going On was a paradox. It was the album that gave Marvin the recognition he craved and the platform he deserved. It proved that Motown could be more than polished love songs. It could be social commentary, spiritual reflection, even prophecy. But for Marvin, it also deepened his sense of isolation. He had created something timeless, but he was still a man burdened by grief, guilt, and the shadows of his past. As the applause echoed around him, Marvin stood apart, quietly asking himself the same question he had asked the world: what's going on? By the early 1970 seconds, Marvin Gaye had achieved what most artists only dream of. What's Going On was hailed as genius, a platinum-selling record that elevated Motown from pop powerhouse to cultural institution. Critics praised it as divine, fans embraced it as prophecy, but Marvin himself could not hear any of it over the storm raging inside. Fame had never brought him peace. If anything, the success only deepened the fractures in his life. At the center of Marvin's emotional chaos was his marriage to Anna Gordy Gaye, the older sister of Motown's founder, Berry Gordy. When they wed in 1963, Marvin was a rising act, and Anna was already a powerful figure in the music business. She was 17 years older than him, sharp, assertive, and as complicated as Marvin himself. To the outside world, they were Motown royalty, a glamorous power couple who embodied the sophistication of the label. Behind closed doors, however, the relationship was combustible. From the very start, passion and conflict were inseparable. They fought bitterly, often, and loudly. There were rumors of infidelity on both sides, whispers of jealousy, and accusations of emotional manipulation. Marvin admitted in later interviews that he could be cruel and withdrawn, shutting Anna out in moments of frustration. Anna, feeling disrespected, responded with rage or silence. Their love was real, but it was tangled in mistrust and wounded pride. The turmoil wasn't just emotional, it was financial. When the marriage finally began to collapse, the divorce proceedings became a battle that nearly destroyed Marvin. As part of the settlement, he was ordered to hand over the royalties from his next album directly to Anna. It was both punishment and humiliation, a legal tether binding his art to the ruins of his personal life. For most artists, this would have been a career-ending blow. For Marvin, it became a strange kind of therapy. The album he delivered, Here, My Dear, 1978, was not just another record, it was a confessional diary set to music. Track by track, he laid bare the story of their love and its collapse. Titles like When Did You Stop Loving Me? When Did I Stop Loving You? And You Can Leave, But It's Going to Cost You were not poetic metaphors, they were real conversations turned into melody. The album was raw, bitter, and unflinchingly personal. At the time, critics didn't know what to make of it. Commercially, it faltered, failing to capture the audience that had once embraced Marvin's sensual ballads and socially conscious anthems. But years later, Here, My Dear would be reappraised as one of the most brutally honest breakup albums ever recorded, a rare glimpse into an artist's soul when he had nothing left to lose. Even before his marriage to Anna ended, Marvin had already stepped into another storm. In 1973, while recording Let's Get It On, he met Janice Hunter, the daughter of a black father and a white mother, a young woman whose ethereal beauty captivated him. Marvin was 34. Janice was only 17. Their relationship began under scrutiny, fiery and controversial from the start. What followed was a romance as intoxicating as it was toxic. They were passionately in love, but Marvin's insecurities, compounded by his growing dependence on drugs, made their bond fragile. He oscillated between devotion and paranoia, showering Janice with affection one moment and accusing her of betrayal the next. His need for control often suffocated her, and the home they built together became a place of ecstasy one day and fear the next. Still, Marvin longed for stability, for the family he never truly had as a child. He and Janice had 2 children together, including Marvin Gaye III, and for a time he convinced himself that fatherhood could heal his wounds. They married in 1977, but the cracks were already too deep. By 1981, the marriage had disintegrated under the weight of addiction, emotional abuse, and Marvin's increasingly erratic behavior. Through it all, the music never stopped. In some ways, his records during this period were a direct reflection of the chaos in his personal life. Songs like Let's Get It On and I Want You channeled his longing for intimacy and connection, even as his real-life relationships unraveled. His artistry seemed to thrive on the very turmoil that was destroying him. But the spiral was undeniable. Marvin was no longer just a man struggling with relationships, he was a man at war with himself. The Prince of Motown, once the darling of the label, was becoming its most complicated figure, his private demons threatening to swallow the music that had made him immortal. By the mid-1970 seconds, Marvin Gaye's relationship with drugs had shifted from casual escape to devastating dependence. Cocaine, once an occasional indulgence, had become a constant companion. He experimented with PCP and hallucinogens, chasing new highs while numbing the pain of old wounds. Every hit was both a weapon against grief and a trap pulling him deeper into darkness. For Marvin, drugs were not about pleasure, they were anesthesia. They dulled the loss of Tammy Terrell, the collapse of his marriage to Anna, the volatility with Janice Hunter, and the unrelenting pressures of Motown. At first, he tried to channel the chaos into his art. Recording sessions became marathons, stretching late into the night, fueled by lines of cocaine and flashes of inspiration. Some of his biggest hits emerged from this haze. Let's Get It On in 1973 wasn't just a sensual anthem, it was Marvin's attempt to reconcile sexual freedom with the need for emotional connection. I Want You in 1976, produced with Leon Ware, was lush, erotic, and obsessive, echoing his fixation on Janice Hunter. Even Got to Give It Up in 1977, a funky party track born from his disdain for disco, became a #1 hit. Irony lingered in every groove. The man who hated the dance craze gave it one of its greatest anthems. But as his music soared, Marvin himself unraveled. Friends and collaborators noticed the changes. He would fire band members without reason, vanish before concerts, or wander the streets in paranoid confusion. Smokey Robinson, Stevie Wonder, and others tried to intervene, but Marvin pushed them away. In a rare moment of candor, he confessed in a 1983 interview, "Cocaine nearly killed me. It was a seductress that turned on me." By the dawn of the 1980 seconds, Marvin's problems could no longer be hidden. His finances collapsed under the weight of unpaid taxes and legal battles. Reports claimed he owed the IRS more than $4 million. His paranoia grew sharper. He spoke often of death, convinced that people were plotting to kill him. Fame no longer felt like a crown, it was a target on his back. Desperate for escape, Marvin fled the United States. He settled in Ostend, a quiet seaside town in Belgium, where anonymity promised a temporary cure. At first, exile felt like salvation. There were no paparazzi, no judgment, no Motown executives breathing down his neck. But isolation soon magnified the voices in his head. He barricaded himself inside apartments, blacked out the windows, and roamed the halls armed. Certain enemies lurked outside. Belgium shielded him from the spotlight, but it could not shield him from himself. Still, even at his lowest, music remained the lifeline. In Ostend, Marvin found an unlikely ally in Freddie Couseaert, a Belgian concert promoter and devoted fan. Couseaert gave Marvin shelter, encouragement, and a fragile sense of stability. He reminded him of his worth, coaxing him back into the studio. For Marvin, this friendship was more than a lifeline, it was proof that someone still believed he had greatness left in him. With Couseaert's help, Marvin signed a new deal with Columbia Records, breaking free from Motown's shadow for the first time in decades. The change was liberating. No longer beholden to Berry Gordy's hit machine, he could create on his own terms. Out of the ashes of his despair came Midnight Love in 1982. The album was a departure from everything he had done before. Embracing modern funk and electronic textures, Marvin fused drum machines and synthesizers with his soulful vocals, creating a sound both contemporary and timeless. The centerpiece was Sexual Healing, a track he co-wrote in Kuzart's apartment using nothing more than a Roland drum machine and a synthesizer. It was intimate, vulnerable, and unlike anything on the radio. When Sexual Healing hit the airwaves, it was nothing short of a resurrection. The single topped the Billboard R&B chart for 10 straight weeks and reached number 3 on the Hot 100. For the first time in nearly a decade, Marvin was back at the center of popular culture. The song won him his first 2 Grammy Awards for Best R&B, Male Vocal Performance, and Best R&B Instrumental Performance. Critics hailed Midnight Love as a masterpiece, and fans embraced him as a legend reborn. But beneath the triumph, the old demons still stirred. Marvin wore bulletproof vests during performances, carried guns on tour, and spoke cryptically about death. His paranoia never eased, even as audiences cheered his return. The Sexual Healing Tour of 1983 was both a victory lap and a descent. Concerts sold out across the United States and Europe, but behind the scenes, Marvin argued with bandmates, isolated himself, and slipped deeper into cocaine use. By the end of the tour, he was physically drained and emotionally broken. Success had given him a second chance, but peace remained out of reach. In late 1983, he returned to Los Angeles, moving back into his parents' home, a decision born of exhaustion, but one that would tragically place him face to face with the shadows he had been running from all his life. On the 1st of April 1984, just one day before his 45th birthday, Marvin Gaye was gone. Shot twice by his own father in their Los Angeles home, the second bullet piercing his heart, he was pronounced dead at California Hospital Medical Center at 10:01 a.m. The world reeled. Fans, artists, and leaders across the globe mourned the loss of a man whose music had given soul to an entire generation. Stevie Wonder, Smokey Robinson, and Diana Ross spoke of disbelief and heartbreak. Thousands gathered for his funeral, where Motown founder Berry Gordy described him as the truest artist the label had ever produced. The circumstances of his death shocked the world even further. The man who gave us Mercy, Mercy Me, What's Going On, and Sexual Healing had not been silenced by drugs or fame, but by his own father, Marvin Gaye Sr., a man whose violence had haunted Marvin since childhood. Charged with voluntary manslaughter, the elder Gaye ultimately received a suspended sentence due to his age and health. Many called the ruling unjust, but the deeper tragedy lay not in the courtroom. It lay in the fact that Marvin's lifelong torment had ended the way it began, inside the walls of his family home. Yet death did not quiet his voice. If anything, Marvin's influence only grew louder. In the decades that followed, he was recognized not just as a singer, but as a cultural prophet. His 1971 masterpiece, What's Going On, became a permanent fixture on greatest albums of all time lists. Praised for daring to confront war, poverty, police brutality, and environmental decline long before those topics became mainstream. Rolling Stone placed it at number 1 in their 2020 ranking. Time, New Mexico, and countless other publications echoed the sentiment. This was more than music, it was scripture for a broken world. Future generations of artists carried his torch. You could hear his smooth falsetto in D'Angelo's neo-soul, his social consciousness in Kendrick Lamar's anthems. Hip-hop and R&B, the genres that dominated after his passing, sampled his catalog endlessly. Tupac Shakur borrowed his vulnerability, Eric B. and Rakim echoed his grooves, Mary J. Blige wove his emotion into her voice, and Drake resurrected his hooks for a new millennium. Marvin's songs became both backdrop and centerpiece, whether to party, to protest, or to grieve. But even as his artistic legacy soared, his financial legacy was far more troubled. When Marvin died, he left behind an estate in disarray. Years of unpaid taxes, legal battles, and drug-fueled spending had left him nearly broke. His catalog, one of the richest in Motown history, was tied up in probate court. For years, his children and family struggled to benefit from the empire he had built. It was a bitter irony. The man who had given so much to the world left little for those closest to him. Then came the copyright case that thrust Marvin's name back into the headlines decades later. In 2015, his estate sued Robin Thicke and Pharrell Williams over their mega-hit Blurred Lines, arguing that it bore an uncanny resemblance to Marvin's 1977 track, Got to Give It Up. The trial became one of the most high-profile music lawsuits in history, sparking debates about artistic influence and theft. In the end, the jury sided with the Gaye family, awarding them more than $7 million in damages. The verdict sent shockwaves through the music industry, setting a precedent that would shape copyright law for years to come. Even from the grave, Marvin was still rewriting the rules. Meanwhile, the honors and tributes never stopped flowing. In 1987, just 3 years after his death, he was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Multiple songs entered the Grammy Hall of Fame, while What's Going On was added to the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry for its cultural and historical significance. Statues were erected, streets were renamed, and his childhood home in Washington, D.C. was granted landmark status. Motown itself helped preserve his memory. In 2019, the label released You're the Man, a long-shelved album originally intended as the follow-up to What's Going On. To fans, it was a gift. Unreleased tracks that reminded the world of Marvin's brilliance and the unfinished thoughts he had left behind. And the story is still being told. In 2023, a long-awaited biopic titled What's Going On, produced by Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine, was finally greenlit. Decades after his death, filmmakers and audiences alike still hungered to understand the man behind the music, the genius, the prophet, the tragedy. What remains undeniable is the scale of his influence. Marvin Gaye wasn't just a singer. He was a mirror, reflecting both the beauty and the brutality of his times. He dared to turn soul music into social commentary, dared to lace sensuality with vulnerability, dared to show that masculinity could coexist with tenderness. He gave voice to questions that are still being asked today. Who really cares? What's going on? In the end, Marvin's legacy is both luminous and haunting. His music lives on as a balm for the wounded, a rallying cry for the oppressed, and a reminder that art can outlive even the darkest tragedies. Though his life was cut short by violence, his voice refuses to fade. And perhaps that is the true measure of legacy, not how long a man lives, but how long his truth continues to sing. Marvin Gaye's story is one of the most powerful contradictions in music history. He was a man whose voice could heal millions, yet he could not heal himself. He gave the world love songs that still make hearts tremble, anthems that challenged nations to listen, and melodies that continue to echo across generations. And yet, his life ended in the most intimate and devastating of tragedies at the hands of his own father, the same figure who had shaped his earliest pain. To call him underrated is not to deny his fame or his influence. It is to recognize how often his genius was overshadowed by the chaos around him. Industry politics, personal demons, financial turmoil, and the stigma of his private struggles. Marvin Gaye should have been celebrated in his lifetime as a prophet, not just a pop star. Instead, he carried the weight of his brilliance largely alone. But time has a way of correcting what history overlooks. In the decades since his death, Marvin's work has only grown more revered. What's Going On is not just an album, it is a cultural monument. Songs like Let's Get It On, I Want You, and Sexual Healing continue to bridge eras, sampled and reinterpreted by artists who stand on his shoulders. His music breathes because it still matters, because the questions he asked remain unanswered. So perhaps Marvin's true legacy is this. He showed us that vulnerability is strength, that truth can be sung as beautifully as love, and that even the most broken lives can leave behind unbreakable art. He was not just the Prince of Motown. He was a mirror, a prophet, a warning, and a gift. And though his life ended far too soon, Marvin Gaye's voice remains eternal proof that when truth is sung with soul, it never dies.